I would encourage every Christian to have a list of arguments memorized that he can share with an unbeliever.
So, Christian advice, Christian apologetics advice is the title on the screen there. That's not bad. Have a list of arguments why you believe. And actually that's, 1 Peter 3:15. It's always be prepared to give a defense. The Apologia or Apologia, which I've named my channel. Makes sense. Good advice.
The typical unbeliever, in my experience, has no good reason for his unbelief.
I need you to burn that sentence in your head. The typical unbeliever has no good reason for their unbelief. Let's see if William Lane Craig backs that up in any kind of way, or if that's just a blanket assertion that he's made about non believers. They have no good reason because William Lane Craig said so.
He's simply been taught to repeat the slogan, "There's no good evidence for God's existence."
So that doesn't seem to be citing statistics or reasons. That is William Lane Craig asserting that most non believers have memorized the slogan. They don't think this, they've just memorized the slogan that there's no good evidence for God. What was his prior thing? There's no good reason for non belief. And the reason why they don't believe, because there's no good evidence for God. All right. Now, also burning your head, here he said no good reason to believe in God. And that's the correct way to say it. There are arguments for God. There is evidence for God. The question is it good evidence? Are they good arguments? So we're starting well. It's not going to end well.
And this is really, I think, a mask for intellectual laziness on
A mask for intellectual laziness is a delicious phrase.
his part, but it serves very effectively as a conversation stopper because
There's no good evidence for God as a conversation stopper, but believers don't have good reason to be non-believers is what? An invitation to have a great conversation? No, they're the same statement, William.
the average Christian doesn't have any good evidence for God's existence. And
But boom, I do like that admission. I didn't. A lot of believers, they don't have good evidence to believe what they believe. They just do. And so that is a great admission. Thank you for making that one. And acknowledging that we're in this world where most people are wandering around with largely unjustified beliefs. I admit both sides of the fence, that's probably the case.
this, in effect, gives the atheist the trump card. There's no evidence for God's existence, and that's the end of the conversation.
Ah, now he's dropped the good part. Now he's accusing the atheist of being unreasonable by now painting the atheist as saying there's no evidence for God. No, you need to go back to this. You need to keep it consistent. The atheist may well be very justified in saying that that person has not seen any good evidence for God. We don't know. Maybe they've not considered it at all, but we want to be charitable, right?
But if you will have a list of arguments memorized at that point, what you can do is say to the unbeliever with a surprised look on your face, "Well, is that what you think? Why, I can think of at least 5 arguments for God's existence." And
But are they good arguments for God's existence? Having memorized a list of arguments does not make that list good arguments, and it doesn't mean that that person hasn't heard them before. Maybe they have.
at that point, he's got to say, "Yeah, like what?" And then
Yeah, like what? But no, the first thing you say is, are they? You might say, are they? Yeah, but what? But the better counter is, are they good arguments?
you're off and running. So when people ask me, "Well, there's no evidence for God's existence," and I say, "Well, sure there is," and
See, you dropped it. When people should be saying, there's no good evidence for God. There's no good arguments for God.
they say, "Well, like what?" I typically just list about 5 arguments. I'll say, "God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists."
God is the best explanation for why anything at all exists. Now, I think it's interesting when we want to consider why there is something rather than nothing. Interesting thing to imagine. Now, William Lane Craig is imagining, but he's not asking the question, God, what's the best explanation as to why there's a God rather than not a God, right? Because it's the same question. If you want to terminate that infinite regress, you need a brute fact at the end. William Lane Craig has decided to terminate his infinite regress with a brute fact of God. But that's not the only option on the table. We could also consider, does that infinite regress end with merely that there is energy, for example, just one example. And if that energy has always existed, it's no less an explanation than why God has always existed. And we know that energy exists. It's a thing we can observe. So one fewer assumption. So no, Dr. Craig, God's not a better explanation. It's an explanation, but omniscient God that is all powerful, an explanation for anything if you want it to be. Again, not falsifiable. We talked about this again. Let's get to the rest of your list.
rather than nothing. God is the best explanation of the beginning of the universe.
Separate question. So he said, why is there something rather than nothing? Probably the most interesting question on his list, but ultimately we can't know. God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. Well, no. Let me see. Actually, I think he tagged the thought.
God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe.
Oh, no, he got to fine tuning. God is best explanation of the beginning of the universe? Not necessarily. Again, if we'd have to define universe again. If by universe he means what I and Carl Sagan would mean cosmos, everything material that exists beyond our universe, our instantiation of space-time, then we're back to that infinite regress. And the first thing we talked about, if we're just talking about merely starting our universe, it's unclear as to whether God is a better explanation than other things, because we don't know what happened before time. It's a weird question to ask, and we don't exactly know. And then now we went to fine-tuning. Let me talk about fine-tuning. God is best explanation for that. First of all, you'd have to actually demonstrate that there was fine-tuning going on. Go see my videos on puddle analogy. If you've not heard of that, definitely go look that up. It's a great counter to the fine-tuning, or at least a great way to think about it. But also, you would need to demonstrate that things could be otherwise. As far as we know, if energy has always existed, energy has properties. Those properties are what the theists look at and say is fine-tuned. But if those properties always existed and always were, then those are, again, just brute facts as to the way they were. And there might be no other way things could have ever been. So, again, you'd have to demonstrate that there is fine-tuning before we look for an explanation for fine-tuning.
For intelligent life. God is the best explanation.
Intelligent life, that's just whether there's life. Oh, actually, I think he was talking about fine-tuning for life. Fine, all the same argument.
Of objective moral values and duties in the
God's best explanation for objective morality, moral duties and values. You'd have to first demonstrate that there are objective morals and duties. I've yet to see anything that makes me even moderately compelled that that's the case. They appeal to intuition, but that, again, is one of those things that it sounds good when you've not given it any thought. But if you start pressing on, do we have the same definition for these things and the same intuition of things, it all falls apart.
world. God is the best explanation of the historical facts concerning Jesus of Nazareth.
God is the best explanation of the historical facts of Jesus of Nazareth. The only historical facts we have about Jesus of Nazareth, and this is highly contested, that he existed more likely than not, and that if that fact is probably correct, is that he died, right? Because he was a human. So those are the two things that we know. God is not needed for someone to exist. God is not needed for someone to die.
And finally, God can be personally known and experienced.
God can be personally known and experienced. Well, if you had an imaginary friend when you were a child, or maybe currently, that's all fine. Your imaginary friend can be experienced and known in some sense, right? But you'd have to demonstrate that God is different than an imaginary friend, or that somehow all of the other religions where their gods who are different than yours are also known and experienced is evidence for them. Like that's just silly.
And I find that many times just giving a list of the arguments is enough to satisfy the unbeliever. He doesn't.
What kind of unbeliever is satisfied with a list? Now, I think maybe you're misreading their intentions. Perhaps they've heard that entire list before, and they now know what kind of believer they're dealing with. If you've heard them all before, not everyone has the patience to hear them over and over like I do. At that point, the list may satisfy you. But if you're literally just like, oh, I didn't know there were any arguments at all for God. Now that you have a list to let me believe, that's not a great reason to. I think, Dr. Craig, you would agree, that's not a great reason to believe, is that your awareness of a list.
Even ask to hear the arguments. Just hearing a list of them is often enough. So,
enough for what? Enough for them to be bored of the conversation, or enough to them to come to belief? If it's the latter, I'm concerned.
I would encourage all of us to have such a list memorized that you can just share at the drop of a hat with an unbeliever. Now, if he does want to press you, each one of those points in the list has an argument that.
Yes, each one has. You would need at that point be prepared to argue each one. I'm concerned with this idea of memorizing them, like just rote memorization. I was a scripture memorizer. I memorized most of the New Testament at some various points in my life. I don't love this recommendation, but fine, we'll leave that part alone.
Has premises or steps that you can memorize and again then share with them. For example,
again, it's much better Don't memorize these steps. Understand the steps, because hopefully the skeptic is coming to you and asking you questions. What do you mean by universe? What do you mean by exist? What do you mean by cause? If you're looking for those kind of things, that's not what you get from memorizing it. That's what you get from internalizing and understanding it. If you're not going to have any better answers if you straight memorize it than if you knew nothing at all.
The argument that God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe is very easy to memorize. It has 3 steps. Whatever begins to exist has a cause.
Whatever begins to exist has a cause. For the sake of this, I could go with this. That is not universally accepted. So, I mean, that alone is enough to point out, Dr. Craig, this is not a premise that is universally accepted. If you just straight up just memorizing it, that's enough to know. But I'm going to let them roll. Everything that begins to exist has a cause.
The universe began to exist, therefore,
the universe began to exist is where my problem sits, because that, again, depends on your definition of universe. It depends on your definition of begins. It depends on your definition of exist. If we're talking about space-time started at a certain point, our instantiation of it. So that has a beginning point, but we don't know of any kind of way that material existed before that, right? So that's where I would have that fight on premise too.
the universe has a cause. And that will show that we don't live in an isolated system, that there is a transcendent cause beyond space and time, beyond the universe, that has brought the universe into being, which has...
Wow. So that's the most humble version of the kalam that I've ever heard him give, because he's not saying therefore God. He's actually saying the proper thing. The conclusion would be there was a cause for our universe outside of our space-time. That's actually honest. Well done, Dr. Craig. That I can agree with. Then we can discuss what all these things might be, but that is just going to be exercise in creativity, right? Because right now we don't have a way to investigate what happened before time. It'd be great if one day we've discovered ways to study such a thing. Until then, your idea is no better than my idea.
Obvious theological implications. So
don't care what the theological implications are. You'd have to first demonstrate that there's a God before I would need to care about whether this is messing any theology up.
Oh, if you have these premises memorized, then you are prepared to actually share the argument with the unbeliever. But in many cases, you won't even need to do that if you just have a list.
All right, there's the end of the video. So, according to William Lane Craig, a list of arguments is as good as an argument. Okay, wow. Again, was that helpful? Was I off the mark? Did I miss the mark? Did anything I say make sense to you? Let me know in the super chats. Let me know in the comments. Would a list of arguments, a list alone, convince you that there is a God? I hope not.